Welcome to another episode of our video series of the mechanics of human existence.
It's good to be back.
It is. How have you been?
Busy, as always. There's certainly no shortage of things to analyze.
No, there isn't, and I feel like that's the perfect place to start. Every day there's just so much noise, so much static, and it makes it feel almost impossible to see the bigger picture, the long-term trends that are really shaping everything.
That is the defining challenge, isn't it? Our job here isn't to get bogged down in the daily tantrums, the political theater.
Right.
It's to give you, the listener, a set of analytical tools, a way to see the enormous reality that's moving just beneath the surface, the structural iceberg, if you will.
A perfect analogy. So our mission today is really synthesis. We're trying to pull together these huge transformations happening in economics and global power, and maybe most importantly, talk about how we can even begin to understand them accurately.
Precisely. We have to start with a rigorous methodology. How do you apply scientific thinking to something as complex, as messy as human behavior?
And that's the first major hurdle, isn't it? This idea of complexity. How do we bring any kind of rigor to a field like social dynamics, where you have all these compounding variables, gender, class, nationality, technology? It's not physics.
It's absolutely not physics, and that is the critical insight.
Yeah.
In social analysis, we're dealing with systems where we're trying to establish a perfect causal inference. Proving that A definitively caused B is incredibly difficult.
Almost impossible sometimes.
We have to acknowledge that limitation right up front. We're looking for high probability trends and correlations, not some kind of classical certainty.
So the goal shifts. It's not about finding one fixed answer, but more about asking the right questions to get a clearer picture, to increase the resolution of our understanding.
Exactly. Since perfect causality is off the table, the focus has to change. In this age of just information overload where, let's be honest, every major news source is filtered by capital or some vested interest, critical knowledge relies entirely on excellent curation. You have to balance opposing, credible arguments to see all the facets of an issue. It's like a kind of intellectual rehabilitation, a self-correction you have to do constantly to filter out the noise.
That idea of filtering out the shadows on the wall, the media's surface noise, leads us straight to the engine room of it all. So let me ask you this. Is every societal problem, every conflict, really rooted in economics, in what you'd call iqtisadiyyat, income and expenditure?
In the historical period we are living in right now, the answer is an overwhelming yes.
Overwhelming.
I think so. All the other systems that used to manage life, whether it was royal decree, religious law, you name it, they've all been subordinated to the economic sphere. We live in a time where the economy simply dominates everything else.
And you've argued this is specific to our time, right? This isn't a universal rule of history.
No, it's not. Look, societies that ran on real money like gold, they weren't obsessing over monthly inflation rates. The whole mechanism was different. Our intense focus on GDP and inflation today, it just reflects the systemic fragility of the post-1971 fiat currency world.
And this is where it gets really critical for understanding modern life.
Yeah.
This shift you call the metallization of life.
Yes. Metallization. Life itself is being systematically turned into capital, into commodities. That's the fundamental process of capitalism, really. Taking something inert and making it an active, value-generating asset.
And we're not just talking about land or oil anymore.
No, not at all. We're talking about housing, sure, but also your time, your personal data, your attention. Everything is being monetized. This trend really took off after the Industrial Revolutions and then just exploded into this all-out consumption culture after 1950.
But if that economic drive is so powerful, what about conflicts that seem purely ideological or religious?
Yeah.
Doesn't passion sometimes just override the economic calculation?
It can feel that way on the surface.
Right.
But when you really dig into the history of these conflicts, you almost always find an economic engine underneath.
For instance.
Take the great Salaali rebellions in Ottoman history. They weren't just random social frustrations boiling over. They were rooted in failing agriculture because of climate shifts, a cooling period, and the central power squeezing more and more resources from the land. At the end of the day, the struggle for resources is the fundamental driver.
Okay, so with that foundation set, let's turn to the present. It really feels like the anchors we used to rely on, smooth globalization, unchallenged Western power, are all coming loose. We need to get rid of these old narratives.
Absolutely. The idea that the U.S. is the sole technological power or that supply chains are stable, these are legacy ideas. We are in the middle of a radical, simultaneous transformation. It's defined by three core shifts.
And you think this is why so many societies feel overwhelmed, because they don't see these pillars.
They're trying to solve 21st century problems with 20th century maps.
All right, give us the first pillar.
Number 1, the new great power struggle. The 20th century was shaped by a rising power challenging the status quo. Today, the U.S.-led order is being fundamentally challenged by China. But, and this is crucial, this is not the Cold War revisited.
Why not? What makes China such a different kind of competitor than the Soviet Union ever was?
Well, the Soviet Union was mainly a military and ideological rival. China is that, but it's also a massive producer and, critically, a technological leader.
In key sectors.
In the most important sectors, electric vehicles, solar panels, battery tech, 5G. The economic and technological center of gravity is just rapidly moving away from the West and toward Asia. That transition is inherently destabilizing.
Okay, so that's shift number 1. What's the second?
Economic realignment and deglobalization. For decades, the entire political consensus was driving this idea of hyper-globalization. You know, the free movement of goods, capital, everything.
That consensus is well and truly fractured now.
It's shattered. The political will is now actively reversing it. Nations in the Northern Hemisphere especially feel that the vulnerabilities in their supply chains and the effects of offshoring have harmed them. So policy is now all about resilience, security, reshoring, not global efficiency.
You see it everywhere with subsidy wars and tariffs.
Uh-huh.
Okay, and the third shift. This one feels the most urgent.
Technological acceleration.
Yeah.
The velocity of change right now is just unprecedented. It's being driven by AI. The leap from just Googling something to asking a generative model to create and synthesize for you.
Right.
And then you add in robotics, automation.
Yeah.
It's moving way beyond the factory floor.
And the risk here is the sheer pace of it. If a society is just focused on, I don't know, trivial political arguments.
They risk being completely unprepared for the structural adaptations that are needed.
Like what?
Like massive investments in next-gen power grids.
Yeah.
Ethical AI integration, widespread workforce retraining. There's this enormous gap opening up between the political conversation and physical reality.
So let's connect these 3 shifts to the inevitable result. Conflict. Is it really as simple as saying war is the noise that happens when wealth changes hands?
We are absolutely in a period where security has become the main lens for everything.
Everything.
Climate change, migration, trade, it's all being framed as a national security threat. And that framing, that securitization, is dominating every major policy decision.
And that kind of competition, that geopolitical struggle, it drives what analysts call the race to the bottom.
Correct. When a major power fears it's losing its edge to a competitor, one that maybe doesn't have the same environmental or labor standards, it starts compromising its own values to stay competitive. It just drags down global standards in a cycle of fear.
So the last great transition was from coal to oil and steel, which defined the 20th century powers. Where is the fight for the next stage of leadership being waged now?
The new struggle for dominance is focused on 5 key sectors. These will define the power structure of this century. We have to watch. Space, deep ocean resources, artificial intelligence, biotechnology, and the control of rare earth elements.
Control those, you write the rules for the future.
You write the rules.
As we analyze this, we also have to avoid what you call falling in love with the story. We can't get so attached to a prediction like the inevitable collapse of a nation that we miss a huge policy shift that changes everything.
That intellectual flexibility, anti-fragility is paramount. You have to be willing to let the data lead the narrative, not the other way around. Policy and capital can reverse even the strongest trends.
And finally, a crucial point. Conflict isn't binary. It's not just war or peace. It exists on a continuum.
And we are in a very dangerous place on that continuum right now. We're seeing all these escalations that are short of overt war. Diplomatic freezes, cyber attacks, a total lack of transparency on nuclear arsenals.
Which creates that classic security dilemma.
A textbook case. One nation's defensive move is seen as an offensive threat by another. And it creates this self-fulfilling prophecy that just pushes the whole system closer to open conflict.
So the whole point of this conversation, this analysis, is really to load your analytical tool chest with this context to help you move past those short-term emotional reactions and towards long-term adaptation.
Exactly. The focus has to shift from just passively consuming filtered news to actively curating and analyzing these macro trends yourself. We cannot afford to miss another great transformation because we were all distracted by the surface noise.
So let me leave you with this thought. We have these technological breakthroughs, economic pivots, and great power rivalries all happening at the same time and faster than ever before. So we have to ask, If the institutions we designed to manage global affairs, diplomacy, finance, international law were all built for a 20th century speed, are we now in a state of unavoidable structural anarchy simply because our systems cannot keep up with the velocity of change? And if so, your focus has to be on how you can accelerate your own knowledge and adaptability to match this new reality.